Okay, so I'm really excited to introduce our speaker today. Rochelle Bush is a descendant of African-American freedom seekers and was born in St. Catharines. She is the proprietor and primary guide of Tubman Tours Canada and the resident historian of the Salem Chapel, British Methodist Episcopal Church, Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historic Site. Rochelle is also a member of the Historical Society of St. Catharines, a past board member of the St. Catharines Museum, an honorary member of the Central Ontario Network for Black History, a certified Niagara Tourism Ambassador, and a new member of Ontario Ancestors Niagara Branch. Over 20 years ago, Rochelle began to preserve, promote, and protect Niagara's rich Black history. This included participating in the development of the early Black history narrative and government tourism initiatives. Rochelle's paternal ancestor, James Pleasant Bush, fled from Virginia in 1830 and settled in Oro Township. Her family is mentioned in the book titled Men of Color, a historical account of the Black settlement on Wilberforce Street and in Oro Township, Simcoe County, Ontario, 1819 to 1949, written by Gary E. French and published in 1978. We have several copies of this book at the library if you'd like to check it out. It's an awesome book. It's a wonderful book. So I'm not going to talk any longer. I'm excited to hear you. So I will turn it over to Rochelle Bush. Thank you so much, Rochelle. Over to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to share screen, share, and from the beginning. Perfect. Well, thank you, everyone. It's nice to be here, and I want to thank Jane for the invitation. But first, because I have the habit, I have to get rid of myself. There we go. Otherwise, I'll constantly look that way, which is odd, and I know a lot of speakers do that. So in order to stop myself from doing that, I remove myself. So this talk is about discovering Niagara's Freedom Trail, and it's about the early Black settlement, in Niagara. So if you want to know more about the African enslavement or the transatlantic slave trade or slavery in Canada and the US, which, you know, was institutionalized slavery or chattel slavery, and the Underground Railroad, you can find more information about those subjects online.
Here we go.
So, yes? Is everything good?
Yeah, I think somebody just didn't have their mic turned off. So
I thought that was you calling me, Jane. Okay, sorry.
No, it's not me. I'm just going to attempt to see if everybody's muted. Okay, make sure you mute your mics, please, people, if you don't mind. Thank you. Okay, take it away, Rochelle.
Okay, thank you. So with regards to terminology, two words that you may be familiar with, but I'll just go over them anyways. So enslaver. So the definition is one that enslaves a person dealing in or owning slaves. So that individual could be the slave trader, the slave owner, or the overseer. And of course, freedom seeker. So it's now the new term, or what is politically correct, for runaway slave and fugitive slave. So just to let you know, I use all the language, the past language and the current language that people embrace today. So a little bit of background. 1619, Jamestown, Virginia. If you watch American news, you're familiar with the 1619 project that was all over the New York Times, the professor that didn't receive tenure at Chapel Hill University in North Carolina. And then, of course, the Republican Party combating this by introducing the 1776 project and what's all over the news now, critical race theory. So this is not a political talk. This is just a bit of background. 1619 was the first time Black people were enslaved in the United States. So the landing was in Jamestown, Virginia. In Canada, 1629 at the bottom, the first enslaved person in Canada, it was actually New France, was a 6-year-old boy by the name of Oliver Lejeune. So the reason why Canada is not highlighted is because we're talking about freedom seekers who settled in Upper Canada at the time. And of course, the majority, well, not the majority, they came from the United States. Thomas Jefferson, the 1769 ad, He was an enslaver, we know that, and he went on to be the president, but he had individuals who ran away, and this is just one of the news articles from the Virginia Gazette. So again, 1769. In 1793, so just fast forwarding a little bit, a lot of slaveholders were outraged at the fact that they could not retrieve their runaways or the freedom seekers. So they pulled together and they had conferences, and they, had multiple discussions until they forced it on the new administration to put a clause into the United States Constitution. So it was an act respecting fugitives from justice and persons escaping from the service of their masters. So that was introduced in 1793 in the United States. 1 month later, Chloe Cooley here in British North America, so British North colony at the time, was bound and put in a boat and forced across the Niagara River. Her enslaver here in what was Newark at the time, it's now Niagara-on-the-Lake, was Adam Varun. So Governor John Graves Simcoe, everybody's familiar with Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe. He fought during the American Revolution, of course, on the British side, and he was a staunch abolitionist. He became a parliamentarian in the UK, well, in London, and when he decided that he was going to take the post as first lieutenant governor in Upper Canada, he did so knowing that he wanted to abolish slavery, and everybody knew that. So those that he fought with during the American Revolution, British loyalists that now relocated to Upper Canada, those that were now in England, and when he arrived, he was trying to figure out how he was going to do that. So back to Chloe Cooley. So the lieutenant governor's here, maybe a couple of months. It's now March 1793. Chloe Cooley is sold to an enslaver in the United States. Of course, he used this as a way to ban slavery. So slavery wasn't abolished in its entirety. There was the compromise, and it became known as an act to prevent the further introduction of slaves and to limit the term of contracts for servitude within the province. So the reason why this is mentioned, 1793 in the United States, they're trying to retrieve their runaways, and 1793 in Upper Canada, Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe and some of his members of the executives, because some were slaveholders, we know that, he was trying to abolish slavery. So it didn't happen. So they were no longer allowed to import people of African descent into British North America, and it was gradual emancipation. So those who were enslaved would remain enslaved, and their children would be emancipated 25 years later. 1833. So that's the introduction to the Abolitionist Act. So the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 took effect August 1st, 1834. So slavery was abolished in its entirety throughout the British Empire. And you're probably familiar that on March 29th this year, so 2021, the federal government of Canada declared August 1st, which is still, it's a federal holiday, but now it's known as Emancipation Day. Some people will refer to it, continue to, as the civic holiday, or in fact as Simcoe Day. But this year it was the designation, so just in a couple of weeks, August 1st will be celebrated as Emancipation Day for the first time in Canada. So images of freedom seekers fleeing from bondage in the United States. Then the Underground Railroad. So it was a secret network of people who helped enslaved African Americans escape from the South to the northern states or to Canada. And it operated up until the time of the Civil War, which was 1861. And of course, the Civil War ended slavery in the United States. So here's a map showing many of the routes to the northern states as well as to Canada. And you can see right here where St. Catharines is highlighted. So what became important in 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Law. So in 1793, Southerners or slaveholders in the United States forced the government to include a clause so that they could retrieve their fugitive slaves, their runaways. Between 1793 and 1850, that was a continual argument because some of the northern states were starting to abolish slavery. So the last northern state to abolish slavery was New York State, and that took effect in 1827. So pretty much between 1827 all the way up until 1850, Southerners were continuing to argue in Congress. So in 1850, a new act was passed, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, and it was a compromise to the 1850 compromise. It was the bill that was included in the compromise. So it was the Fugitive Slave Bill, and it became known as the Fugitive Slave Act or the Fugitive Slave Laws. So it was the most controversial out of all 8 that were included in the 1850 compromise. It was the bane of the Southerners' existence because they wanted to retrieve their runaways. So that individual on the far right side is the image that was featured after 1850 on the runaway slave ads, so the bounty ads or the wanted posters. So a lot of the abolitionists or anti-slavery activists in the North deemed it the new slave catching law. So it was an amendment or a way to implement stricter or harsher laws on top of the 1793 laws. So with this, they now had the right to go into the northern states. It became a slave catcher's haven. So they could go anywhere they wanted. Any individual who was of African descent could be accused of being a runaway. So if you were a free Black person, perhaps you were manumitted by a former enslaver, maybe 3 generations earlier, or you were just born free, and that's how it was early, going back to 1619, and it was a generational thing. It didn't matter. You could be tried and convicted without a judge or a jury. And of course, many free Blacks were being kidnapped. You're probably familiar with the book by Solomon Northrop. It's the title of the book is escaping me right now. I'll get back to that. It'll pop into my head. But this is what was happening at the time. So it didn't matter. And fugitives who had, say, they escaped in 1830 and now they're settling, say, in a place like Ohio, and they've been living freely for the past 20 years, they could be captured as well and returned to slavery. Early Black settlements in Niagara. So this is just sketches of how it was like for pioneers to live. So it didn't matter whether you were Black or white. These are just individual sketches. You were living in the log cabin. You had to, cut down the trees. You had to do everything. So you had to harvest your own food as well. So here's an image of a Black loyalist who would arrive after the American Revolution, and then a Black loyalist or a pioneer settler. You had to do the work all on your own. So it didn't matter whether you were Black or white. Of course, I'm just featuring Black folks right now for this presentation. So early Black settlers living in British North America, again, the same thing. You wanted a cabin or you wanted your own home, you had to cut down the tree, you had to do the work yourself. Enslaved individuals living in Niagara. So you will see here from 1804, Niagara, I'm going back one. And then Sue was enslaved in 1795, she ran away. And then of course, 1793. So they're all individual places in Niagara. So the images, of course, of enslaved women, one to purchase an enslaved girl from an ad, and the other 2 are to recover runaway slaves. So as it was happening in the United States, it was happening here as well, even after 1793. So people did not want to remain enslaved, even in Upper Canada and Lower Canada, for that matter. Some of the settlements in Upper Canada at the time. Unfortunately, Barrie is there, but Aurelia is cut off. Well, you can see, well, that's not Aurelia. So I do apologize, but this is the map that I was able to get off the internet. And of course, St. Catharines right here. So this is a map of Lincoln and Welland counties circa 1820. This is the map of it again, but it's a drawing. And it shows you the different locations. And then of course, the Niagara River, and then Niagara Falls would be in this area. So these are the early settlements in Niagara in 1820, and then of course in 2020. So the name changes as what's actually being displayed. So for example, St. Catharines, it was once called Grantham Township, and then it became St. Catharines. And this is a current map of today of Niagara. Niagara's Freedom Trail. So this is what's highlighted, and this is the 26th anniversary of Niagara's Freedom Trail. So it was actually put together in 1995, and it was designed for tourism. So it's a tourism initiative to highlight many of the locations in Niagara that are significant to local Black history. Fort Erie is at the top. Now, Fort Erie was one of the gateways to freedoms that many runaway slaves actually, that was their first glance seeing a British colony. So once they arrived at Buffalo or Black Rock, they're looking across the water, so the Niagara River, and they're actually seeing Fort Erie. So I'm just going to back up once again. So here's Fort Erie down here, and Buffalo is right here, and then Black Rock was just 4 miles below. So it was just in this area here. So the colored cemetery still stands in Fort Erie, and it's a primary tourist attraction. It's now under dispute as to how many people of African descent are buried there, but we do know there is definitely one person of African descent buried there with the surname Bright. The Fort Erie BME Church to your right, that was constructed around 1848. In the 1960s, it became a residential building. So there's a few apartments inside of there. What's important with Fort Erie is the Niagara Movement. So yesterday was actually the Niagara Movement's 116th anniversary. So after the Civil War ended, of course, in the United States, there was the Reconstruction movement, and then there was Jim Crow laws. And at that time, there was a gentleman by the name of Booker T. Washington, who felt that it would be best if Black people more or less conformed to the new ways of life. Rather than striving for a higher learning or a higher education, just continue as a sharecropper, learn a trade, you know, have a minimal education. Well, then there was a group of people who were against that. So in the center of this picture, the group picture, you'll see the gentleman who's actually looking towards his right in the brim hat. His name is W.E.D. Du Bois, so William Du Bois, and he's the first Black person to graduate from Harvard University. And he was a professor in Atlanta. And he was against what Booker T. Washington was saying. So he organized the Niagara Movement. It was supposed to take place in Buffalo, New York. Up until a year ago, the thought was that they relocated to Fort Erie to continue with this movement because they could not get any hotels based on racism and discrimination in Buffalo, New York. Now going through a lot of these gentlemen's diaries, they're finding out that, you know what, it was too radical in Buffalo. Too many spies were there listening and eavesdropping, and they wanted a much quieter place to organize. So they moved over to the Fort Erie Beach Hotel. So that's the Fort Erie Beach Hotel there. It no longer stands. What is there in Fort Erie is that plaque that's at the lower right-hand corner. So that's the commemorative marker that was put up about 6 years ago, recognizing the Niagara Movement as well as the Fort Erie Beach Hotel and the amusement park that was also there. What's important about the Niagara Movement? It was the forerunner to the NAACP, so the National Advancement for the Association of Colored People in the United States, which remains, it was formed in 1909, and today it continues as the #1 civil rights movement for people of African descent all over the world. So the NAACP came after the Niagara Movement, but it was still W.E.B. Du Bois, who's in the center. He formed the Niagara Movement as well as the NAACP. Also, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Josiah Hanson, we're familiar with his story. He escaped from enslavement. He was enslaved in Maryland. He was sent to Kentucky. He was a trusted enslaved person to the point where his slaveholder had him relocate from Maryland to Kentucky over 20 people who were enslaved. And along that journey, Josiah Hanson was told by several people, let them go, set them free. Hanson decided not to. He was married at the time. He made it to Kentucky, and he thought that his enslaver loved him. Turns out his enslaver did not. Josiah Hanson was told that he was about to be sold away from his family. So separated from his family and sold off. And he made a decision in 1830 to run away himself. So Josiah, his wife, and his 4 children. He was already injured. He had a bad back, and they were traveling by foot. So he made a makeshift backpack and put his 2 infant children, so toddlers, both under the age of 2, in the backpack on his back. And that's how they made their journey to Canada. And they landed in Fort Erie in October 1830. Chippewa is another highlight on the Niagara Freedom Trail. So what's known about Chippewa is that the Colored Corps was stationed there for a while. And you're probably familiar with the story of Laura Secord and her husband, James, that they had their home in Niagara-on-the-Lake, as well as after the War of 1812, he became the postmaster and he had a station there in Chippewa. So Chippewa is a thrilling little village, very picturesque, not as picturesque as Niagara-on-the-Lake, but it has many stories to tell as well. And from Buffalo, there was always a ferry run that stopped at Chippewa twice a day. So many of the freedom seekers, if they did not want to depart somewhere along the 3 or 4 stops in Fort Erie, they could always depart at one of the stops in Chippewa. And that's the Chippewa Bridge. Niagara Falls. With Niagara Falls, there's only one documented account of Harriet Tubman, and we'll discuss her in a little bit, of escaping to Canada. So we don't know where she crossed, whether it was Buffalo, Black Rock into Fort Erie, or Queenston, Lewiston, or Youngstown and Niagara-on-the-Lake. We don't know where she crossed prior to the construction of the suspension bridge in 1855, which is in the top left-hand corner. Tubman, we do know, in 1856 crossed at that bridge in November with a party of 3. Joe Bailey, his brother William Bailey, and their friend Peter Pennington. That's the only documented account of Tubman crossing into Canada. And that was documented by Sarah Bradford, her first biographer, in a book entitled Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman that was published in 1869. So suspension bridge, also in the top left corner. So if you look closely, you can see Niagara Falls in the distant background. So the train rode on top of the bridge, underneath carriage, as well as people could cross by foot. So horse and buggy underneath. So it was the railway suspension bridge. Table Rock to your far left corner. So Table Rock was a feature. It had its early beginnings in 1802. And then as it developed, Table Rock, of course, evolved or progressed. Last year was during the pandemic. Table Rock received some new added features as well. And of course, it's the flagship stop for Niagara Falls tourism. To the left, to the right, the Clifton House. Magnificent area. I wish it was still standing, but there's a lot of history there with Black waiters and Black waitresses. So people of African descent in Niagara Falls, because it was a main tourist attraction, if they didn't become entrepreneurs and they needed employment, just as they would in St. Catharines, there was the tourism industry. So you could become an omnibus driver, you could become a domestic or a maid at one of the hotels, a cook or a waiter. The Clifton House is also known as one of the locations that during the time of the Civil War, there was a lot of espionage taking place there, whether it was Confederate officers or soldiers or spies that were there trying to overthrow the Union Army from the Canadian side, or whether it was Union officers, spies, as well as soldiers who were either convalescing there or spying on their counterparts. So in Niagara Falls, we have the Niagara Falls MBE Church, which is in the top right corner. The Niagara Falls MBE Church had its early beginnings around 1838. The gentleman directly underneath, his name is Oliver Parnell. So Oliver Parnell escaped from Maryland in 1855, The church was already established, but it was on the top of Murray Hill where the casino now sits today. So in that general vicinity. So the legend is that it was so cold that they had to move it on logs down the hill. Oliver Parnell provided them with the property for the new location where the church is now located at Gray and Pierce Street. And that was around 1885 that he provided them with that property. The top corner, Burr Plato, so that's an image of him in 1885. In 1856, he, along with 7 other young Black males, escaped from enslavement from Virginia. They made it as far as Buffalo. They were in hot pursuit. There were bloodhounds after them, along with their slaveholders. All 8 of them jumped into the Niagara River, as the story goes, and they swam across the Niagara River, the upper Niagara, to make it to Fort Erie. Plato could not read or write, as education was forbidden for anybody who was enslaved. So they weren't allowed to have an education. Plato decided, you know what, I'm going to go to night school. And he did. And he received a formal education. He had his own business. He was an omnibus driver. He became an entrepreneur. But what is amazing about this man is that he was so well liked in the community that he decided by the time 1885 rolled around, he wanted to be an alderman. He was already a naturalized citizen, but he wanted to participate more in politics, and he became an elected official. And his picture hangs in City Hall today in Niagara Falls. The bottom right corner are Nathaniel Dett. So his ancestors, of course, were also freedom seekers. They escaped from Virginia as well. Nathaniel Dett eventually, when he was a teenager, moved to Niagara Falls, New York. And that's because his mother wanted to leave Niagara Falls. So some have glorious stories, and they're very affectionate stories with the white community and the Black community. And then there are others that are blatant racism. Nathaniel Dett's brother was murdered. The mother felt that it happened through the white community, but she couldn't prove it. So she just decided she was going to leave Niagara Falls. In doing so, she entered him into a prestigious school, and he decided to further his education. He became an accomplished musician. He studied at the Hamptons. There's the Nathaniel Dett Chorale that's around for him. Well, it's named after him, I should say. And he's buried in Niagara Falls, New York as well. So he adopted that as his home city. But if you Google him, as well as Burr Plato or anybody else on here, you'll find out about their magnificent histories, but especially our Nathaniel Dett. Not only did he tour the United States, he toured Europe as well. Then, of course, there's Queenston. So we already mentioned Chloe Cooley, who was abducted. Well, I can't say abducted because she was actually owned by her enslaver. So she was bound and gagged and carried across the river. So here's the lower Niagara River at the bottom. So at the top, it's a picture of Queenston, Upper Canada at the time, and it's the painting you can see between 1803 and 1807. And then the bottom right is the aerial view from Brock's Monument. That's at Queenston Heights. So that's from 1912, but that's the side. So to our left side is Queenston. The right side, of course, would be Lewiston, New York. So that's where Chloe Cooley was sailed across the river. At Queenston Heights, there's the plaque for the Colored Corps. So the Colored Corps was formed during 1812. Richard Pearpoint was instrumental in establishing the Colored Corps. So I'm going to get to Richard Pearpoint in a second as well. But also up at Queenston Heights, not only is there this provincial marker celebrating the Colored Corps, there's another federal marker that went up 2 years ago. So it's a National Historic plaque about the Black militias that were in the area. And of course, during the War of 1812, some of these Black soldiers seen battle. The Battle of Queenston Heights, for example, is one of them, where General Brock was killed. So in Niagara-on-the-Lake, The top corner is the William and Susanna Stewart House. And again, everything that I'm discussing, you can always Google and find out additional information about them. So they arrived in Niagara-on-the-Lake 1846, 1847. And that's the little cabin that they built. And eventually, a few years later, they left and they moved on to other parts of Ontario. But Niagara-on-the-Lake was one of the primary settlements for people of African descent. And today, there's still a host of Black history there, a wealth of information there. There is also directly underneath that, the old courthouse. It no longer stands, but that's where the Solomon Mosby affair took place. So Mosby escaped from Kentucky. He stole a horse. His enslaver was after him. The charge was horse stealing. His enslaver wanted him to be extradited. That did not happen. So, and the only reason why it didn't happen is because the community came together, Blacks and whites, and they fought his enslaver. 2 people were murdered, where they were killed during the battle, and Mosby escaped. So the legend is that he made it to England and then he returned back to the Niagara area. But the Solomon Mosby affair was the first racial riot ever to occur in Canada. And again, you can Google that information. Negro burial ground still stands, but you can see the only 2 markers. It's not only a provincial historic site, but it's also a national historic site. Legend has it that in the 1940s and 50s, there were many tombstones or gravestones, but then some of the locals decided, you know what, these would work great as patio stones or, you know, as stones to stop the mud that are in the barns and, you know, other features on the property. But I mean, that's a common story everywhere. So it's not just in Niagara-on-the-Lake they can tell that story. You can tell that story throughout Ontario because it happened. And in some places, if they can get away with it today, it still happens, which is unfortunate. In Niagara-on-the-Lake, a couple of years ago, they developed the Voices of Freedom Park and a Black History walking tour. So if you're ever in Niagara-on-the-Lake, it is phenomenal. It takes about 2 hours to do the entire walk in the downtown area, or, you know, yes, I'll refer to it as that, the downtown area. St. Catharines. So this is my connection. So to the Salem Chapel, as Jane mentioned earlier, no, Jane didn't mention it. You spoke about my Bush family. I do apologize, Jane. So my connection to St. Catharines is my 2 times great-grandfather was the minister in charge at the Salem Chapel when Harriet Tubman arrived. So his name is James Henry Harper. So he was a traveling AME minister. He was born in South Carolina, and for a lot of my life, I was told that he was a freedom seeker or a runaway slave. Well, around 2005, I found out that that is not true. He was a free Black man, and he was a carpenter. So in the 1850 U.S. federal census, he is listed with his wife and their children. So his wife, Margaret, and their children. But he first arrived in St. Catharines in 1838. So he was about 26 years old when he was here. He went on to be a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He became a deacon several years later. And then his family was still in South Carolina, so he traveled around quite a bit. Then after that 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, he decided to pull out of South Carolina, and he brought his family to St. Catharines with him. So that's my connection to the Salem Chapel. He was the minister here for a period of time. To the right-hand side is the Zion Baptist Church. And in the center is the current Zion Baptist Church. So the Zion Baptist Church was actually demolished in 1958. The famous person connected to the Zion Baptist Church is Reverend Anthony Burns. Both churches were built by African-American freedom seekers. So the Salem Chapel was built in 1855. The Zion Baptist Church was built in 1844. With the Salem Chapel Church, it's the 3rd church in St. Catharines. So the first one was built between 1814 and 1820. The second one was established around 1835, and that's because the community was relocated to make way for the first Welland Canal. And then after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law passed, that second church was too small to accommodate the growing congregation, so this 3rd church was built. Richard Pearpoint. So he fought for the British during the American Revolution. Pearpoint was enslaved. He was born in 1744 in Bondu, which is now modern day Senegal. He was enslaved about the age of 16 in 1760, sold to a British officer. And when the call was put out for all Black males who were enslaved to fight for the British or fight for the crown, after the war you would gain your freedom, Pearpoint decided that he was going to enlist. And he became a member of Butler's Rangers, which was the 18th century elite special forces unit. After the war, he settled in Grantham Township, which is now St. Catharines, and he became the first person of African descent to settle in the area. So he's recorded as that. In 1812, when the War of 1812 broke out, Pearpoint was now about 68 years old, and you probably remember the stunning Heritage Minute commercial with Pearpoint arguing with a British officer because he wanted to raise a militia, a Black of men to fight. And he was told, don't do that, just go farm your land. So I mentioned earlier about the Colored Corps. Well, that's the group that Pearpoint was actually raising. But of course, with racism and discrimination, Pearpoint wasn't allowed to lead the group. They were led by white officers. So in that Heritage Minute, Pearpoint is arguing because it's documented, and he's telling the white officer who's telling him, you know, you don't need to fight. This is a white man's war. Pearpoint is telling him, I was born a free man and I intend to die a free man. It was after that that white officers started to think, okay, these people have more skin in the game than we even thought of. And that was because white officers were fighting for various reasons: keeping their home, keeping their wealth, keeping their family. Black men were fighting for all that. Free Black men, of course, because during the War of 1812, people of African descent were still enslaved, but there were free Black males, and the majority of them were Black loyalists. They were fighting for their wealth and their homes as well, but they were also fighting for their freedom. If there was an American invasion, they would have been re-enslaved, and they knew it. So it didn't take long for white officers to come to terms with that, but they did, and they allowed them to fight alongside with Indigenous allies. Harriet Tubman, of course, she's the main individual in St. Catharines as well as the Niagara region. And for the most part, if she becomes an individual on the face of the $20 bill in the US, then she's going to be the face of the Underground Railroad. Many people think she is today, and of course, myself included. So Harriet Tubman, as we know, helped emancipate hundreds of individuals, and she brought them to St. Catharines. After that 1850 Fugitive Slave Act was passed, she said that she wouldn't trust Uncle Sam, the American government, with her people no longer. She brought them all clear off to Canada. Anthony Burns, I mentioned, was connected to the Zion Baptist Church. He was enslaved in Virginia. Around the age of 19, he escaped. He made his way to Boston. Unfortunately, under that 1850 fugitive slave law, when his enslaver met up with him on the streets of Boston, Burns made the mistake of acknowledging him. So he was tried and convicted without a judge or a jury under the 1850 fugitive slave law. But in Boston, there were a lot of radical abolitionists, Black and white. They stormed the courthouse. One of the individuals that was protecting Burns, a police officer or law enforcement officer, was murdered. It cost the US government $40,000 to return Burns to slavery. So it was 5 days of rioting. It was the largest abolitionist revolt in US history. Burns was returned to slavery. 50,000 people were along the streets. They had about 2,000 law enforcement officers to patrol the streets, some on horseback, some with shotguns. Burns was enslaved once again. About a year later, his freedom was purchased. P.T. Barnum offered him $100 a week to speak at the New York American Museum to tell his story. Burns said no, because he didn't want to tell his story next to the Bearded Lady or Tom Thumb or the Siamese Twins. He accepted an offer from a white woman, a Quaker abolitionist, who paid for him to study theology in Oberlin College. So he attended there. After he graduated around 1858-59, he went on to Indiana. When they found out who he was, they wanted him to leave because they felt that his freedom and his case years earlier would agitate individuals. So they asked him to go. and there were racial restriction codes there. So he eventually made his way to St. Catharines in 1860. This Zion Baptist Church was in financial ruin. Burns turned that around, but he became very sick. He had tuberculosis, and he died in 1862 at the age of 28. And he was laid to rest in Victoria Lawn Cemetery here in St. Catharines. So these are my connections, all the yellow dots to the Niagara area. So as Jane mentioned to me, she said it's part of the Genealogy Club and some members would be participating. So I don't know if all of you have done your DNA. I did mine last September. The shock of my life. For 3 days, I was in the fetal position, and they do tell you, if you don't want to know anything about your DNA, don't do it. So if you think there's something in the background, well, I was always curious because, you know, with most families, if you're so many generations Canadian, everybody's saying, oh yeah, there's an Indigenous background or Indigenous ancestry. None of that was true for me. But since last September, I find out all these dots here are my connections to the Haldimand County area, as well as Niagara, and of course, formerly Welland counties. As Jane mentioned, my family on my paternal side arrived from Virginia, and we're in this book, The Men of Color. So the reason why I have the arrow here, so James Pleasant Bush is my great-great-grandfather, and in Gary French's book, you'll see where the arrow is, his eldest son, John Jackson. So he's my great-grandfather, and you'll see at the bottom, they probably left Oro Township just after their marriage. So in that little paragraph, he's saying, I'll back up one sentence. It is not known what became of this branch of the family. Well, I can tell Gary what happened. So John Jackson, he arrives. He's marries Angelina Legier, and she's from Grimsby. So let me just back up. Where's Grimsby? See, Grimsby is just in this area right here. So who would think that? So she's here. They're in Grimsby, and she's white, and she's French. And I'm getting to this because it was the shock of my life in my DNA. So I'm looking at the census, and this is before I did my DNA, and I find out that John Jackson is actually living here in Pelham with Angeline. So she disappears, and he now has another wife, and it's like, how is all this happening? So again, this is before the DNA, so I'm trying to piece it together. So then I find out that his oldest son, my grandfather, James Bush, was born in Pelham. I always thought these people were just straight Oro and Toronto connection. Not true. So then I do my DNA, and there's my grandfather. First, I'll point him out. So in the top left corner, second to the left. So he's standing next to his brother-in-law, far left corner, Abraham Jameson. So here's my grandfather here, James William Bush, and here is his sister, Clara Bush, and that's husband and wife. So I do my DNA, and I've got people that I have no idea who they are, and they're in between me and some other relatives, and I'm wondering, why are they there? Turns out John Jackson and Angelina had a son. Yeah, the end. So I'll get to that as we're answering questions, and I'll just tell you a bit more of it. So that's the end of it. Thank you so much. And some of the source material comes from the book, The Freedom Seekers, Donald Simpson's book, Under the North Star, Owen Thomas' book, The Niagara's Freedom Trail. And I wish to express my thanks to the Aurelia Public Library, especially Jane, also the Genealogy Club, and everybody who attended this virtual presentation. If you're interested, you can follow me on Tubman's Tours Canada on Facebook. And again, thank you so much. Jane, I will hand it back to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was awesome. I knew it was going to be awesome, but that was awesome.
A lot of talking.
I've learned so much. So I really appreciate you participating in this. And as soon as I get down there, I'm coming to see you and take the tour. So does anyone have any questions? If you do, you can send them in the chat, or you can turn your mic and camera back on and ask yourself.
Can I mention this about the tours?
Yes, absolutely.
So that's just Niagara's Freedom Trail. With the tours that I do, I incorporate a lot more. So I go off the beaten path because I love the Confederate story. I find it to be extremely thrilling, and I love the Loyalist story. Both are thrilling. So with the Loyalist story, especially in Niagara-on-the-Lake, they're small patches of land in comparison to what would have been in the South, but they are our northern plantations, and both are significant to Black history. So that's why I incorporate both. Yes. Thank you, Jane.
Sounds super interesting. So Dave Osborne, to everyone, excellent presentation, very informative. I learned a lot. Thanks.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
No? Wow.
Wow, quiet group. Oh, what happened after you did your DNA?
Which part? I found out that I come from very old stock, but that I knew. And thank you for that question. So with the John Jackson Bush one and the Angelina Legier, they had a son. So thought, why are all these women disappearing? But they're dying from childbirth. So they had a son, and now that whole branch of the family. So with the Bush family, I'll just speak to that for example. So John Jackson was the eldest, and then there were multiple children after that. John Jackson's branch, from what I've traced, other than 3 that married African Americans and moved over the river, well, we call it over the river, going Niagara Falls, New York, or Buffalo, moved to a stateside, are all white now. So everybody married somebody white, and everybody looks white. So their child would have been biracial, and he married somebody white, and then their children married somebody white. The same thing in my mother's family. I'm looking at these people like, what is going on? And then I had to Google and do a lot of research and find out that Black people, they're not high in numbers doing the DNA test. So 50 million people, they say, in North America have done DNA. And, you know, at the bottom of the Ancestry DNA where it says additional communities, well, there was one there, African American communities in Virginia. Well, where's my connection? I had to go back 3 and 4, and in some cases 5 generations, which was unbelievable. And then I found out at the top of that list, it said Southern Ontario Loyalists or early settlers. So I knew immediately it was a Loyalist. I always felt that, well, we always knew that someone in our ancestry who, well, was Irish, not Irish. The individual's half and half Irish, half English. So a great-great-grandmother, Margaret Graham, so in 1840, she's a descendant of Loyalists, and she's marrying James Stewart, who was a runaway, and they settle in Cayuga County. Unbelievable. And then there's another one from Port Robinson, and I won't be able to trace this one. She was orphaned in 1862. I knew that on the documentation from finding the marriage certificate, but I did have a glitch. It wasn't Indigenous in my family tree, and I won't call it a glitch, but I will never be able to answer this question. Italian ancestry that keeps appearing, and it's fluctuated between 6% all the way up to 17%. So I'm never going to know where that comes from because I'll never be able to trace that individual, which is sad. She was orphaned. And in Port Colborne again, a large group of the Colored Corps. So the Colored Corps was stationed there, not Port Colborne, Port Robinson. The Colored Corps was stationed there, so we don't know. So she was an admixture of Black and perhaps Italian. Don't know.
Wow.
Very
so
sad.
Fascinating. Wow.
Oh.
Couple more questions. So what is the story of Oro in terms of Black settlers? And in the Owen Sound area, there is a road called Negro Road. Do you know about it?
I know somewhat about it, yes. So isn't it Negro Creek Road? Or is it just Negro Road? I thought it was Negro Creek.
Maybe she'll answer. Kathy, do you know if it's Negro Creek? Oh, Oh, one new message. Here we go. Don't know, she said.
Okay. So, and what do I know about that? I just know it was controversial a number of years ago, and the Black community there fought to keep the name Negro Creek. I'm sure it's Negro Creek because they wanted to change it because they thought it was derogatory. So I guess politicians thought it was derogatory. Yes, and wasn't there was just recent controversy about cemetery, developing something near a cemetery in the same area. Pioneer Cemetery. Yes. I hope that helps.
Someone else, thank you for explaining this. I think the same has happened in Simcoe County with intermarriage. Someone else said, hello there, I am in Port Coburn, which was Humberstone on your map. I love that there is so much history other than the War of 1812. I had no idea the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin had a close connection in Fort Erie. I will need to check out some of these sites this summer.
Nice.
Oh, someone did comment here. It is Negro Creek. Can check out more at Grey Roots Museum in Owen Sound.
Yes, yes.
And another thank you very much for this seminar, Rochelle. I appreciate your story and your presentation. I learned a lot. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Oh, thank you. You as well. Thank you.
Anybody
Wonderful.
else? So please consider going down to visit Rochelle as soon as we can. Like I'm chomping at the bit. I can't wait to get back to normal and go and take tours and visit. And oh, one more story. Hang on. Story of Oro, Wilberforce Street, second line of Oro. There's a historical plaque with the church. And then someone else said, Rochelle, you know so much more than we had time for today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And I know you do.
Yes. Thank you.
Are you considering writing a book or anything?
I'm working on one.
Awesome.
I am.
Awesome.
So it's in the works, and it takes a long time because you want to be historically accurate, and many people write books and then they'll just give you a list of sources at the back. I want to go old school and reference because, how can I say this? There's some stuff that people aren't even looking at anymore. Like it's so far advanced in a different direction that they're not even looking at what was happening in the past. So yeah, I'm trying to write like they did, say, maybe in 1940, so that everything is thoroughly referenced, and it takes time.
Yeah.
And there's 2 pieces of information that I'm on the hunt for. And if I can't find them by the end of the year, I'm just going to give up.
Wow. Yeah. That sounds fabulous, but yeah, a lot of work.
Thank you.
Someone else is asking how long your family was in Oro before they went.
The Bush family?
Yeah.
My Uncle Mark moved out of Oro in 1938. So from 1830, for him being the last one, 1938. Now those are the individuals that still carried the Bush surname, to my knowledge. So it's the Bush surname, because don't forget the Thompsons, the Johnsons, the Skidmores, all those other families that are connected to Oro were there as well. And a lot of them emigrated down this way. So my branch actually left in 1862. So my direct branch. Yes.
Cool. Someone's asking what info you're looking for, but what I might do is it's Janet Houston, get in touch with you, because I'm sure what info you're looking for is a lot. So.
Oh yeah, well, it's at the Library of Congress, so it's with the Freedmen's Inquiry Commission. So.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a trip to Washington if I'm able to get there because of the pandemic.
Right. Right. So lots of thank you, which is absolutely 100%. Thank you so much. It was fabulous, so interesting, and you have so much knowledge. Fabulous.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much for joining us. Take care, everybody. And Rochelle, I'll be in touch with you at some point soon. But in
Wonderful.
the meantime, everybody, I just got a warning for a tornado, so we made it
Best
through
of luck with that.
without losing power. So take care, everybody. Thank you for
You
joining
as well.
us.
Thank you.
Thank you again,
Thank you,
Rochelle.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.